we're going to start with a discussion of Jews in the medieval economy, and it's going to be a little bit more broadly focused than some of the other talks, especially the more biographic talks that we've done before. And then we're going to really focus in on a couple of aspects of the Jews in the medieval economy, specifically commerce and then finance. So these three short talks will give you a sense, however, about the nature of the Jewish economy in the medieval period, particularly around the High Middle Ages in particular. So let's start by talking a little bit about agriculture, which is not one of the areas in which Jews were especially active during the medieval period. Historically speaking, Jews have, of course, been farmers, not only in the biblical period when this was the main economic mainstay of the Jewish people, as we discussed way back in this Jewish History Lab series, but also in the modern period when you come to modern Israel. And as a matter of pride, the Jews specifically moving to Israel attempted to return to the land. Now, to a certain degree, this was motivated, of course, by the necessity of producing agriculture for this increasing population in the Middle East, but also because it was a reaction to kind of 19th century ideas. Much of the thought in Europe in the 19th century, both on the right wing of the spectrum and the left wing of the spectrum, as both of these areas were developing, kind of like looked down on any people or population that was not specifically connected to agriculture. There was this idea, for example, if you look towards socialism, there was this idea that, deriving economic profit from the fecundity of the land was somehow healthier, more normal, more, honest, as it were, than commerce. Because commerce, after all, deals with buying things cheaply and then artificially selling them for a higher price. That's how commerce works. And for much of the medieval period as well, there's been this kind of disdain for commerce. It was always considered some kind of sharp behavior or shrewd behavior. And Jews and Christians, and to my mind, I believe Muslims, all had a certain amount of hesitancy over the nature of commercial profit and sought to regulate that. It was the idea, for example, of the so-called just price, the correct amount that an object may be inflated in value in order to cover the costs of the seller, the person who is the middleman. And we have discussions of this in the Talmud as well. By the way, it's something like a 35% markup was considered more or less normal, but there are so many reasons to avoid that or get around that. So at any rate, so on the left, you have this idea that Jews, being a traditionally urban people for much of their diaspora history, were somehow, like economically unhealthy or even immoral. And on the right wing of the spectrum, then you have the development of this idea of the folk, which would later become a very powerful ally of the idea of race, that somehow the character of a people was formed by their connection with the land, that somehow by digging their fingers into the soil of their native land for generation upon generation, somehow this created a unique character. The Italians with their things, and the Northern European Aryans with their things, and that was like part of like what it meant to be a person. Was you developed the culture that you had somehow imbibed by having generations of genetic attachment to the land. The Jews, of course, did not have this attachment to the land, and so therefore they were somehow unhuman. They were like not human in the same way as others were human. So there was a very big push in the 19th century to try to get Jews back to the land. And we see this not only in Israel, we also see it in all kinds of colonial projects in the Americas, in the Russian Empire and so on, where there's like encouragement for Jews to engage in farming, and they largely succeeded. I mean, Israel's agricultural output is really impressive and so on, but it contradicts a large trend in Jewish history, which is primarily towards other types of commerce, as we shall see. Agriculture posed a lot of risks without necessarily all the benefits that Jews would associate with a profitable endeavor. First is that Jews are frequently expelled from a given region. France expelled the Jews. I think it was 4 times in the 14th century or 3 times in the 14th century. It was every other generation you could be expelled from your land. If you had invested all of your income, all of your wealth in land, then of course it was completely gone because it's hard to run with 40 acres on your back. There were areas where Jews were forbidden to own land, but those were actually more of the exception than the rule. It was simply not a very wise investment for Jews, not only agriculture, but even like rental properties, because who's to say that you'll be able to keep that land if the political environment changes and you're dispossessed of it. Furthermore, it's a really hard job. I once spent a summer weeding, and it was horrible. You're bent over in the sun, and you're thirsty, and you're picking, the carrots apart from each other so they all grow at the best rate. I mean, my gosh, who would want to spend 8 hours a day doing that by hand? Really, really hard work. And, if the crops go bad, forget about it. So lots of reasons why Jews would not want to go into agriculture, and a lot of reasons why other forms of profit were good. Now, the last and perhaps the most important thing in many ways that could have started with this idea really is the fact that the Jews were not, especially in medieval Europe, slotted in the right spot in the corporate structure of medieval society. I'm going to explain what that basically means, but essentially Jews were not expected to become farmers, and Jews as farmers would have been way out of step with their role in society. And when I say role, I can do so for the medieval period because the way much of medieval Europe thought, people occupied roles in society not so much by their individual identities, as we would, let's say, for example, in Western Europe or in America, but by their class, and in the case of Jews, by their religion. They occupied a different box, very caste-like, almost like the Hindu system of Varna, not nearly as extreme, but in that same family, where they weren't supposed to be doing any farming. That wasn't for them. So let me explain a little bit about what this corporate structure of medieval society was, and then it'll be much easier to understand the Jews' role in that economy. Okay, so here's a basic schematic of what corporate society looks like. You have the king, okay, he's the chief officer of the country, and then you have below him the nobility that are typically charged with running particular sections of the country geographically, and then below them, this map is not to scale, a huge massive amount of peasants, right? Those are three basic corporations in medieval society. There are more, but these are the basic ones. And the idea is that the king and the nobles provide protection to peasants, right? This is kind of one of the working theories as to how feudalism developed. It's a very old working theory, but the idea is that those elements of the population that were much better, warriors or organizers or leaders, sort of rose to the top, and they took on the responsibility of providing protection for those classes underneath them. And in return for that, because after all, they could not be farming and defending the border at the same time, so the peasants, and to a certain degree the nobles, provided taxes to the king. Right, the money flows upward and the protection flows downward. If it sounds a little bit like a protection racket, you might not be that far off from the idea of how this works, but nevertheless, that's the sort of working idea of how feudalism was supposed to work. The vassals, the lower classes, and class is not precisely the right word, but close, owed fealty to higher classes who in return had to protect them. That was kind of like the compact that held it all together. this was paralleled to a certain degree in the church. You had the Pope, and we're specifically now thinking about Catholic Western Europe, although much of this is broadly generally true for the Eastern world as well. And below the Pope in a hierarchical structure are the clergy. And you've got a whole bunch of different groups in the clergy, not just the priesthood, but you also have monks and nuns and so on, and they occupy slightly different roles. And below them, the big mass of Christians. And similar to the arrangement with the kings, nobles, and peasants, you have salvation coming down. That is, the Pope and the clergy provide those essential religious services and education as appropriate, and salvific acts that allow the lower classes to achieve their place in heaven. And in return, the lower classes, the Christians in general, and then upwards the clergy and the Pope, provide tithes, provide a type of taxation that keeps the entire system working. Now, you might ask, when you look at these two structures, you might ask, well, who was ultimately in charge? And in fact, that's something they worried about as well, because in some periods, it was clear that the king was in charge of a given region. But on a philosophical level, one could make an argument that the Pope really should be in charge of European society, and the church sometimes was ascendant. And this meant that there were times when the interests of the king took precedence, which was typically good for the Jews, and there were times when the interests of the Pope took precedence, which was typically, but not uniformly, bad for the Jews, as we shall see. This is essentially how the corporate medieval structure of society looked. But now the biggest question you may have is, where do the Jews fit in? What box do they occupy? They're certainly not nobles. Peasants are overwhelmingly involved in agriculture, so they're neither of those boxes. They're not the clergy, and they're not Christians. So where do they fit? So here's where Jews fit in. It's really important. They occupy a position which was later called servi camerae regis, which means servants of the royal chamber. The Jews ultimately ended up becoming specifically subservient only to the king. And that was largely because of their economic role in society. Here's a really beautiful piece that probably does not depict two Jews, although they're engaged in a classically Jewish occupation here. The reason why they're probably not Jews is because the woman here is clearly reading a Christian book that shows a Madonna with child there. There's also, by the way, since we're down here, a little interesting sort of peek in the mirror of the artist probably looking on as he paints this picture. But the idea of this image, which is a 16th century Dutch work, this is a money changer and his wife. If you looked at those boxes I showed you earlier in the corporate structure, who exactly is making the money here? Who exactly is working literally in coin? The peasants certainly not. They're working with goods. They're producing agricultural output. The nobility is not out there mining the rocks for silver and gold and so on. Who is actually producing and circulating coin in this environment? In order to collect taxes, for much of medieval European history, the nobility and the king had to collect it in different ways. Either taxes in kind, which meant, barrels of wheat and hides of foxes and things like that, or corvée, which is essentially taxes in time, where the peasants would be required to spend a certain number of days per week or per month farming the king's large land holdings or the nobles' land holdings, or the most valuable type, but the hardest to come by, cash. The peasants typically did not hold much cash. All of their transactions were effected with barter, and when they paid their taxes, they paid it typically either in kind, their agricultural output, or in the sweat of their brow by actually working for the king. So the Jews here occupy this fascinating position as servi camerae regis, as servants of the royal chamber. You could also translate that as serfs or slaves, maybe, of the royal chamber, in which, because their economic activity does involve actual cash money, they collect a lot of this very valuable coin, and their taxes to the king are paid directly to the king with no intervention of the nobles at all. So even though they don't actually occupy a box in that corporate structure that I showed you, their box, as it were, is kind of stuck off to the side, and there's an arrow going straight to the king because they produce that money. I should also point out, as I think I did earlier, but let's emphasize it once again, that just like what we saw when we talked about the Jewish communal structure in the Middle Ages, the king didn't deal with Jews as individuals at all, nor did he deal with Christians as individuals either. He dealt with them as an entire community, meaning if you were a Jew that lived in, let's say, Regensburg, you were part of the collective that was required to pay a certain amount of money to taxes to the king every year. And that amount of money was collected by your community leaders in the Kehillah, and they would forward the correct amount to the king directly. You yourself were basically unknown to the king. There were exceptional individuals. We'll talk about them, God willing, much later, the so-called court Jews. But otherwise, it was done entirely on a communal fashion. And the Jews had this ambiguous position where, on the one hand, because they produced so much of this cash, they were very valuable to the king. But on the other hand, in order to keep doing their job, which the king liked very much, they were protected directly by the king. And so the nobles and the peasants would undertake great risk if they were to harm Jews in any way, because that meant that they were interfering with the king's own revenue stream. So that's the risk and benefit associated with this kind of activity of being servi camerae regis actually turned out to be a preservative for the safety of Jews in Europe. Now, it also meant, however, that as we saw in the earlier diagram of the two arrows with the king and the pope facing to each other, the church-state power was often fought over who controlled the Jews. Sometimes, if the church was especially doctrinaire and wished to impose certain, pious wish to impose some pious persecution of the Jews on some doctrinal point, and if the king was not powerful enough to protect them, then he would lose that revenue stream. On the other hand, there were times when the king could become heavily indebted to the Jews and would find it much more expedient to simply cancel his debts by expelling them, and the church might be powerless to protect the Jews, who were, after all, given a particular slot in eschatological history by people like St. Augustine, saying that the Jews have to serve as a witness. So the Jews were kind of like buffeted by powerful forces, much more powerful than they, largely because of their business acumen. So at this point, I've given you kind of a sense of like where they fit in the economic structure. I'd like to talk next about how they exactly made that money. First in terms of commerce, and then in terms of finance.